Oh, do you enjoy exploring forests, discovering nature, abandoned places and things, seeing all the crazy critters that are to be found in the woods? Well, I'm fixin' to run that for you too. What you're about to hear are forest exploration horror stories. Stories about people wandering about in the woods, discovering things that should never be found. Sometimes those things are alive and angry. Enjoy these stories. Now let's begin. I was never scared to explore the woods alone as a kid. I would actually get a little excited if there were creepy sounds like cracking branches or rustling of the leaves. It gave my imagination a chance to grow. In 1984, as a 13-year-old boy, I didn't spend my time in front of a computer or playing video games. The smartphone would just be a thing of our imaginations back then. I spent my days exploring and creating new worlds in the fields and forests near my southern Arkansas home. Sometimes I'd invite my best friend, but most days I was alone. My dad traveled for work and was gone for weeks at a time, while my mom was always busy at home doing housework and taking care of my baby sister. I guess the best place to start is Memorial Weekend. My mom was in the hospital with some complications from giving birth to my baby sister. My dad had not made it back home from his last trip yet, so I stayed at my best friend Randy's house for a few days. He only lived about a mile down the gravel road from our house. I had a vivid imagination, but Randy, well, let's just say he liked to venture into the darkest areas of fantasy. He was always trying to find new ways to scare the heck out of me. Randy had a fascination with heavy metal and the occult. He was also curious about ghosts and talking to the dead. That evening after dinner, he had this bright idea to have a seance in an old Civil War-era cemetery that was in the woods halfway between my house and his. I'm sure he had no idea what he was doing and was making it up along the way. He swiped a couple of candles from his mom's cupboard and an aluminum pie pan, and we headed down the road. We arrived at the cemetery a little after noon. The ground was soggy from a morning rain shower, and the sky was overcast. It was a nice setting for two young boys who wanted to scare themselves. We decided on a spot in front of a small cracked headstone that read Reginald Young, 1846-1863. It didn't say whether the young man was a soldier or not, but by the math he was 17 when he died. Randy told me that we needed to prick our fingers and drip blood into the pan as an offering to the spirits. So he pulled out his pocket knife, and we both pricked our fingers with the tip of the tiny knife. After we both had dripped a few drops of blood into the pan, Randy held it over one of the candles until it began to bubble. As we sat there, watching that bit of blood cook, Randy spoke to Reginald out loud, asking him to let us know if he was there. We waited quietly for a couple of minutes, and even though I was skeptical and a little amused, I was also slightly on edge because we were doing something that I was always taught was wrong and dangerous. Suddenly there was a loud clap of thunder that made Randy drop the pan. It was followed by a deep, rolling roar that sounded to me like an angry spirit whispering, "Run." We didn't give that horrible sound a second thought. Randy had dropped the pan and we were both on our feet in seconds, breaking into a dead run through the woods. I've no idea why we didn't head back to the road. I guess we were so scared we just weren't thinking clearly. I ran for what only seemed like minutes when I finally calmed myself. I bent over and put my hands on my knees to catch my breath. I started to laugh when I realized how ridiculous we both were. However, when I turned to say as much to Randy, he was not behind me. I looked around and I did not find him anywhere. I yelled for him, but the only sound I heard was the creaking of branches. We must have gotten separated. I was sure he had been right behind me. The only thing I could do was to head back to his house and make sure he made it home. I calmly started walking in the direction I thought we'd come from, back towards the road. But I walked and started to realize that none of my surroundings were familiar. No one had ever taught me to just stay in one place and wait. I'd played in the woods my whole life. I was sure I'd find my way out. As evening approached, more rain moved in. I was starting to get cold because I was soaked clean to my skin. I topped a small hill, hoping to figure out where I was. There I spotted an old abandoned car. It was rusty, and one of the doors was missing. The seats were shredded, and springs were sticking out in places. The roof was all dented up, but it didn't seem to be leaking, so I crawled in and curled up in the back seat and tried to get warm. At some point, I dozed off. I guess all the excitement and stress of realizing I was lost had worn me out. I'm not sure what woke me, but I was suddenly aware of a horrible smell. It was like a skunk, but mixed with rotting meat. I sat up and covered my nose. I was a little scared to investigate, unsure of what I would encounter, but I slowly climbed out of the car to look around. It was quite dark by then. I didn't see anything in the near vicinity, but as I slowly regained my senses, I could hear a sound coming from somewhere through the trees. It sounded like one step followed by a dragging sound, and then another step. It kept repeating and seemed to be getting closer. I was cold and tired, and I'd already been through a lot. The tough kid in me had pretty much vanished at this point. I looked around for a place to hide. The car was too open with the broken door and busted windows, and it was getting too dark to run. Not to mention I was scared I would run into whatever that was in the woods. So I did something that I probably wouldn't have under any other circumstance. I walked around to the trunk of the car and I tested it to see if I could get it open. Luckily, the latch had been busted long ago. I lifted it up and carefully crawled inside. I slowly lowered the lid and waited. The smell of mildew and rust was strong, but not as strong as the horrible smell coming from the outside of the car. I lay there still as I could be, and I listened. The sound of whatever was coming through the woods had stopped. I waited a few more minutes and began to lift the trunk slowly. As I held it open, just enough to almost stick my head out, I heard it again. This time, it was closer, maybe even as close as the front of the car. I lowered the lid quietly and tried to hold my breath. It occurred to me that it could be Randy. Maybe he had finally caught up to me. But why did he smell so awful? It would be safer to wait and listen than to try to take a peek. So I lay there and listened to the step-drag-step sound approaching. My heart was already racing, but just when I thought I couldn't be more scared, a loud thud, like a huge fist, hit the top of the car. Almost instantly, the step-drag-step was joined by a scratching sound like nails on a chalkboard. That scratching sound was coming right across the top of the car and headed for the trunk. The scratching started to sound more like knives on a glass window and grew louder and louder. Just when the sound was right above me, it quickly stopped. I listened, trying to intensify my hearing with sheer willpower, but there was nothing. I could hear no scratching, no steps, no crickets or branches blowing in the wind. All I could hear was my heart pounding. The hairs on the back of my neck felt as if they were crawling, and I was overwhelmed with the feeling that someone was looking at me. The only thing I could see from inside that trunk was the light coming from the hole where the latch should have been. As I fixed my eyes on that light, something moved in front of it. I raised up just a hair, and my eyes strained to adjust. I realized there was an eye looking back at me. It didn't look human. Those eyes were red and bloodshot, and the pupils were elongated. I threw my body back into the trunk as far as I could go, and I let out a scream so loud it temporarily deafened me. It felt like a dream, where you scream at the top of your lungs, but nothing comes out. My screams were silenced for a moment as a thud hit the trunk so hard that the whole car bounced. As I started to scream again, I could hear something screaming with me, or it may have been a roar. It was hard to tell. The lid to the trunk caved in, but not enough to touch me. My screams were replaced by cries, and I felt as if I was going to drown in my own tears when I realized that the banging and bouncing had stopped. As the seconds trickled into minutes, I awaited with sobs that turned into hiccups, and eventually I fell into an exhausted sleep. I am not sure how long it was until my eyes opened again, but I do remember the first sound I heard. I heard my father's voice yelling my name. I slowly opened my swollen eyes and cleared the fog from my mind. My heart raced again, but this time with relief and excitement. I started to yell and bang on the lid of the trunk as loud and hard as I could. It took them another hour to get me out of that trunk. It had been caved in from the outside and had gotten stuck. No one could figure out how I got in there or how it had gotten caved in. After I told them my story, they searched the area, but they could not find any signs that anyone had been in the area. Even my footprints had been washed away. The car had a few branches lying on it from the rainstorm the evening before, and still looked like it had been there for years. But one thing was different. There were grooves in the ground where it looked like the car had been moved a few inches. Randy was safe. He was with my dad when he and the search party found me that day. He was the one that found them, and the hoof prints. These bizarre prints made a complete circle around the car. Of course, the adults credited this to the livestock that had gotten loose during the rainstorm, but Randy and I had other suspicions. I miss the peace and adventure that I used to find in the forest. I will treasure those youthful memories. However, even as an adult, I still have nightmares about that night. On many nights, that red bloodshot eye is the last thing I see before I wake from these horrible dreams. I'll never try to contact the dead again or spend rainy days in the cemetery, but most of all, I'll never walk in the woods alone. This story was told to me by my dad a few summers ago, when I asked if he knew anyone who had experienced anything supernatural. I'm writing this from memory, so some details might be missing, as I didn't experience any of this myself. As a kid, my dad used to live on a farm, which was located pretty close to my current home. Leading to the house, there was about a kilometer-long track that went through the forest. One autumn day, when my dad was around 6 to 7 years old, he was wandering along the track away from the house, when in the midway, a pitch-black creature appeared, approximately 100 meters before him. The being was the same size as an adult, completely black, and its body resembled that of the grog, from the Finnish stories called the Moomins. The leg's nose and mouth were not visible, but it did have black and round, empty eye sockets, with a grayish color surrounding them. The creature didn't make any sound, it just stared, and it only moved if you looked away or moved yourself. It would stop immediately if you looked straight at it. Horrified, my dad stared at it for a while, before sprinting back home. According to him, the creature followed at jogging speed, with these weird bouncing hops, but before reaching the house, the thing would disappear. Dad never told anyone because he felt like no one would believe him. This incident wasn't the last one, as the creature would frequently appear as my dad walked along that path. As soon as there was only about 10 meters in between him and the creature, Dad would make his escape, and as always, the creature would be gone just before he made it home. Soon after all this had started, he wouldn't go near that trail unless it was absolutely necessary, and fortunately, the school was the opposite direction. One day, his father asked him to chop some firewood near the track. Dad told me how scared he was the whole time, and how he kept glancing around as he was hacking at the logs. Just for a few seconds, he lowered his gaze, and as he looked back up, the very same pitch-black creature was right in front of him, staring straight at my dad. He dropped the axe and ran as fast as he could, without daring to look back. Just as my dad was starting to doubt himself, he overheard the boy from the nearby farm telling people at school about how he was one day throwing some rocks against a barn's wall when from around the corner a black creature appeared. The boy was startled, and by instinct he threw a rock at it, which caused it to disappear. Dad never told this boy about his experiences, and to this day, that boy doesn't know that my dad had seen the same creature. Even though the being didn't make an appearance that fall and winter, and actually ever since, he told me he was terrified of encountering it again on the path for many years to come. He was left with some trauma. He told me how some holes in a carriage reminded him of the creature's eyes, and that made him scared in that very moment. On another occasion, a picture in a newspaper of a sniper made him anxious because the rifleman loosely resembled the black being on the road. When my dad first saw the picture of the Groke, he said Tove Jansson, the creator of the Moomins, sure as heck knew what a boogeyman looks like. For years I wondered what he meant by that, but now I know. Traditionally, Girl Scouts do this hike at night. As a kid, I particularly remember it, and also remember the terrors it caused myself and some others. How it is done is during the day. The older scouts, usually between the ages of 15 to 18, start to prepare with the leaders. They cut out large yellow cat's eyes from construction paper and have phrases written on the paper. They staple the papers to various spots in the hike during the day. Usually this hike is done as a partner hike, with one leader to every 4 or 5 girls, and we're given flashlights. So how does this become scary? Well, the trail is haunted. Flying G Ranch in Colorado is historically a working farm and horse rescue. It has since shut down due to a fire. But while working the trail used for the Cat's Eye hike, I used a stagecoach trail and went to each different area of the camp. So each area would have different parts of the trail going through it. I hated going to even use the bathroom because we always heard a strange roar like a mountain lion, which in the history of the camp there had never been one there that close. But during the hike, you would hear something. The Cat's Eye hike was always a warm-up for brownies and juniors, just a test to see how brave we really were. And for me, this one night as a junior proved to be the worst ever. I was teamed with guests, specifically Tiger Scouts from a neighboring Boy Scout camp. These kids could barely be 7. I was hoping I didn't get led, but since I had a better flashlight, that was going to be me. I had one adult leader, and he was not even aware of how this hike worked. That night, I could have sworn something else was with us. There was the usual sounds the girls make during the hike. There was one kid I swear was crying. Now we read off each plaque as we go along, and the strange sounds were getting louder. Suddenly I hear something much worse than an actual roar. The adult leader heard me whisper, "We need to head back." Before he asked, another troop leader met up with us and guided us back to the lodge. We heard a loud crash, and then a popping sound. We were soon back at the door to the lodge, with the leaders from both Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts informing us 2 very large mountain lions must have been in the camp. We were told to stay inside, and our stuff was brought from the various campgrounds to us. The Boy Scouts were packed into their buses, and they left. I kept my thoughts to myself about what I felt and saw. Several of us girls remember red eyes watching us when we walked that trail, and we remember that on that Cat's Eye hike, we were scared away by something much worse than mountain lions in the forest. We just never said what it was. We never talked about it. We never found out what was in our camp. But to this day, I'm convinced that Fly G Ranch has a skinwalker, not a mountain lion. Daniel was my childhood best friend from my neighborhood, and he lived in the building next to mine in the year 1993, if I recall correctly. We all called him Dan for short. This is his story, and he swears it's totally true. Since Dan was 8 or 9 years old, his mother, his stepfather, and him moved to a small neighborhood in a city in South America, which is located in a valley and is surrounded by a big mountain on all sides. The neighborhood was on the east side of the city on a dead-end street of a closed neighborhood, but there were a lot of green areas all around it, such as small hills with big and small trees, plants, flowers, grass, 2 parks, and a sports court. When Dan and his family moved to the neighborhood, he was very happy because when they were getting there in his mom's car, he would see a lot of places where he could play. As a kid, that was very exciting to him. Even though the hills, woods, and plants that surrounded Dan's new neighborhood looked really nice during the day and while the sun was up, they looked very dark and creepy at night, and he thought they were a little too scary. He swears he felt an ominous presence from those woods at night. At that age, Dan was afraid of many things. The dark, the woods, wolves, black dogs and cats, spiders, sharks, you name it, just like me. But it may have been partly because he was a total mama's boy at 5 years old and for most of his life. When Dan and I met for the first time, we were both playing in the park while our babysitters were watching us. After talking to each other for a while, we immediately bonded and became friends. We had a lot in common. We began to talk about our favorite TV shows and movies, like Star Wars or Dragon Ball Z and the X-Men cartoons and Ninja Turtles, among many others. So we used to play by pretending we were superheroes or some other cartoon character while running around using the merry-go-round, the slides, the swings, and funny enough, we both had plastic lightsabers, so we fought as if we were Jedi or Ninja Turtles. And we never stayed in the park once the sun went down. Our babysitters didn't let us, or we would be too scared of the woods to stick around. Dan wasn't my only friend in the neighborhood. I began to introduce him to my other friends who lived in my building, nearby buildings, and houses. We all became great friends as the months went by, because almost every afternoon we played sports, played in the park, played Nintendo, climbed the hills and woods behind our buildings during the day. We did everything together. The neighborhood kids liked to joke around by saying that the woods behind the buildings were haunted. At the time, we played hide and seek or cops and robbers, so we'd be running around the street until 7. That was our curfew, and we had to do our boring homework. But Dan and I went to bed late at night in secret while we talked quietly on the phone. At night, at about 9 or 10 p.m., Dan asked me the following. "Did you watch X-Men today?" "Yeah, dude. Of course. I wouldn't miss it for the world." "Did you see the fight against Apocalypse and the Four Horsemen?" "Yeah, dude. That fight was awesome. I loved it." "But talking about something else, have you heard some creepy noises behind your building at night?" "No, bro. I'm a deep sleeper, so I usually black out everything around me." "Wow, I wish I were that lucky. I usually can hear footsteps in those woods at night, and I also sleepwalk from time to time. Anyway, I think it's time for me to go to sleep. See you tomorrow, and take care." "Sure thing." "Talk tomorrow, and take care too." Dan hung up his favorite hamburger-shaped phone, sat down in bed, and grabbed an old fantasy book about dragons that was on his nightstand. He started to read, until he began to close his eyes and drift off. He fell into a deep sleep, and he thought he was dreaming. In what he thought was a dream, Dan could hear the crickets in the forest, but he was awakened by some strange steps walking around the forest and the leaves crunching beneath them. It was like some person or animal was walking in the woods. There are a lot of cats in our neighborhood, so he thought it was one of those cats. Maybe it was a possum or owl. All of a sudden, he heard a low whisper that beckoned him, saying, "Daniel, it's Professor X. The X-Men need your help. Come to the woods and help us." This strange yet familiar voice was so similar to the professor's voice from his favorite cartoon, and it sounded like it was right outside his window. Since he was a naive and innocent child, he decided to get out of bed, put on his jacket and boots. He took his glasses, then exited the apartment, going to the ground floor. Once he was on the ground floor, he walked to his building's parking lot. He felt a little chill, so he rubbed his shoulders with his hands. The voice kept calling out to him, "Help the X-Men, Dan." Somehow he felt extremely attracted to this voice, like it meddled to magnets. He couldn't get it out of his head. He took a small leap to get on top of a small hill. He felt scared, but kept walking into the dark and creepy woods. As he walked, he heard footsteps and leaves crunching beside his. They sounded like they were approaching his position. In that moment, he stopped walking so he could hear the steps more clearly. He thought it was some crazy person or animal that was insane enough to walk in the woods in the middle of the night. There are a lot of cats in our neighborhood. Dan then figured it was one of those cats. Once again, maybe a possum or an owl. But then he heard a noise that sounded like a roar. He thought it sounded very similar to the sounds the dinosaurs make in the movie Jurassic Park. He had seen it in a theater a few weeks before, and the fast steps from someone or something began to run in his direction. Dan broke out of his trance. He looked around, and his little kid's mind felt so terrified that he passed out. Fortunately, when he fell to the ground, his body was positioned between a tall tree and a large boulder, so he barely heard how this trickster creature ran next to him, circled his location, smelling the air to get his scent, but he guessed it decided to leave. Dan assumed he had passed out for several hours, because he was awakened by the sound of a woodpecker, cicadas, and birds that were on a nearby tree, as well as the heat and glare of the sun on his face. He rubbed his eyes and opened them, looking all around him. He was in shock and felt horrified when he looked at his Spider-Man watch and saw it was 6 a.m. He had awakened in the middle of a forest. He thought he was going to wake up in his bed because, like I said, he assumed he was dreaming, but he had been sleepwalking inside the forest in order to follow that beckoning voice. He saw how his clothes were full of fallen leaves, so Dan quickly stood up, brushing the leaves from his arms and legs. Then he ran away from that creepy forest, which looked normal during the day. He climbed down the forest until he got to the parking lot. He ran to his building's door and opened it, running into the elevator. He saw himself in the mirror and could not believe what had happened to him. Dan got to his apartment's door. He opened it silently, tiptoeing inside the apartment's hallway, and he saw that thankfully his mother had not awakened yet, since she would never believe what had happened. So he went to bed and stared at the ceiling, trying to process what had occurred last night. Now he completely believed his parents when they told him not to talk or listen to strangers, especially if they are in the middle of a dark and creepy forest. Dan had so many questions. He thought to himself, how did this creature imitate Professor X's voice? How did it know I would listen to it? How did it know I loved the X-Men cartoon? Maybe he would never find out, or maybe he would. Who knows? Now that we have come to the end of this episode, if you like these stories, then hit the like button, press the notification bell, and subscribe for more spine-tingling content. And we will see you in the next story.